A sickle flashes, severing the sky. Blood spills into the churning Aegean, white foam bubbling from a father's scream. How does the embodiment of pure love spring from such an act of hatred? Welcome to Somnolent. Aphrodite was never a passive object of desire. She is a primordial force of cosmic chaos and political fire, a terrifying sovereign power that broke great kings and rewrote the laws shaping the fate of the ancient world. To understand this power, we must look beyond the marble temples of the Acropolis and the whitewashed ruins of the Aegean. We must travel backward through the centuries, leaving the familiar shores of Greece for the dust and heat of the Fertile Crescent. The goddess the Greeks called Aphrodite was not born in their land. Her roots are buried deep in the sun-scorched earth of ancient Mesopotamia, in the cities of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. Thousands of years before a single Greek poet picked up a stylus, she was already a veteran of the human heart and the field of slaughter. She was known then as Inanna, the queen of heaven and earth. In the Sumerian world of 4,000 years ago, Inanna was a deity of terrifying complexity. She was the morning and evening star, the light of Venus that heralded both the start of the day and the coming of the night. But she was never just a celestial body. She was the mistress of contradictions, ruling over the ecstasy of the bedchamber and the carnage of the front lines. The Sumerians did not see these as separate spheres. To them, the same heat that fueled a lover's pulse was the very same fire that drove a soldier to madness in the heat of combat. Inanna was often depicted standing on the backs of lions, draped in gold and jewels, but carrying a bow and a quiver of arrows. She was a boundary crosser, a sovereign who could descend into the world of the dead and return, forever changed and dangerously potent. As empires rose and fell across the Mesopotamian landscape, Inanna evolved. To the Akkadians and the Babylonians who followed, she became Ishtar. She was the most multifaceted figure in their pantheon, a cosmic storm who could grant a king his throne or level his city to the ground in a fit of pique. Ishtar was capricious and utterly autonomous. Her myths are full of blood and fury, stories of a goddess who demanded absolute devotion and punished those who failed her with a cold, divine efficiency. She was the archetype of the feminine as a force of nature, an entity that could create life or extinguish it with equal indifference. The journey of this goddess toward the west began with the merchant ships of the Phoenicians. Along the trade routes of the Levant, she was worshipped as Astarte. She was the patron of sailors and the protectress of the great trading fleets that connected the east to the west. It was here, in the salt-heavy air of the eastern Mediterranean, that her warriors' armor began to shift. The Phoenicians, the master navigators of the ancient world, carried her cult to the island of Cyprus. This island served as the great crucible of the Mediterranean, a crossroads where the cultures of the Near East and the emerging world of the Greeks collided and fused. On the rocky shores of Cyprus, particularly at the site of Paphos, the fierce Eastern queen met the Greek imagination. The Greeks who landed there encountered a goddess who was ancient even to them. They saw her high temples and her strange, powerful rituals, and they began to absorb her into their own stories. But they also began to change her. The Hellenic mind struggled with the idea of a woman who led armies and stood over lions. They lived in a world where the roles of men and women were becoming more strictly defined, more rigid. To make her fit their new social order, they began to peel away her literal weapons. Slowly, the bronze breastplate of Ishtar melted into the shimmering, translucent robes of the Greek Aphrodite. The scepter was replaced by the scepter of beauty, and the bow was handed off to her son, the winged Eros. The Greeks focused on the foam-born aspect of her myth, the story of her rising from the sea near the Cypriot coast, emphasizing her grace and her allure. They turned her into the daughter of Zeus, a member of the Olympic family who could be managed and bartered. Yet the transformation was never absolute. The Greeks could not entirely wash the blood of the East from her hands. Even in the height of the classical period, the echoes of her violent ancestors remained. You see it in the way she was worshipped on the island of Cythera, another major stopping point on her journey from the East. There she was honored as Aphrodite Aurea, Aphrodite the warlike. In these older, darker sanctuaries, she was still depicted holding a spear, a reminder that her beauty was never meant to be a comfort. It was meant to be a weapon. The Greeks took the external carnage of Ishtar and turned it inward. The arrows of the ancient Eastern goddess didn't disappear, they became invisible. Instead of piercing the skin of soldiers on a battlefield, they pierced the hearts of kings and commoners alike. The bloodlust of the old world didn't vanish, it became the agonizing sting of obsession, a force that could ruin a life as surely as a sword. Aphrodite became the goddess of the irresistible, the power that forces a human being to abandon their logic, their family, and their crown. By the time she reached the Greek mainland, she had been polished into a vision of divine elegance, but underneath that marble skin, the heart of a Mesopotamian storm still beat with a relentless primordial fury. She was no longer leading armies into the field, but she was still the power that destroyed cities from the inside out. This was the inheritance of Inanna and Ishtar, a beauty that carried the weight of a conquest. This inheritance of power found its way to the rugged coasts of Greece, where the poets began to grapple with a goddess who refused to be easily categorized. To understand her, one must look at a fundamental fracture in the Greek imagination. There is not one Aphrodite, but two, and the distance between them defines the boundaries of the Greek world. This division begins with the poets who laid the foundations of their religion, Hesiod and Homer, who each offered a different account of where she came from and, by extension, who she was permitted to be. The older, more visceral account comes from Hesiod. In his Theogony, the birth of the goddess is an act of cosmic violence. He describes a universe in its infancy, dominated by the sky god Uranus, who suppressed his children until his son Cronus struck him down. With a sickle of flint, Cronus severed the genitals of his father and cast them into the surging sea. From this divine wreckage, a white foam began to gather around the immortal flesh. As it drifted past the island of Cythera and toward the shores of Cyprus, a woman stepped out of the waves. She was the foam-born Aphrodite Urania. This version of her origin makes her a being of terrifying antiquity. She is older than Zeus, older than the order of Olympus, and born from the very essence of the primordial sky. Because she was born without a mother and without the act of procreation, she represented a love that was celestial and pure, a force that governed the movement of the stars and the fundamental attraction that keeps the universe from falling apart. She was a goddess of the mind and the spirit, an elemental power that owed no debt to the generation of gods that followed her. But as the Greek city-states began to formalize their pantheon, this ancient, independent power presented a problem. A goddess who predates the king of the gods is a goddess who cannot be easily controlled. This is where Homer offers a different path. In the Iliad, the narrative shifts entirely. Gone is the severed sky and the primal sea foam. Instead, Aphrodite is introduced as the daughter of Zeus and a minor goddess named Dione. She is a princess of the royal house of Olympus, a child who can be scolded, a daughter who runs to her parents when she is wounded on the battlefield. This is Aphrodite Pandemos, the goddess of all the people. By giving her a father and a mother, Homer effectively brought her to heel. He integrated her into the divine family tree, placing her firmly under the authority of Zeus. In this Homeric tradition, her power is no longer a cosmic law, it is a department of the state. She is the patron of physical desire, of the heat of the moment, and the messy earthly business of human attraction. This distinction between the celestial Urania and the earthly Pandemos was not merely a matter of poetic preference, it was a political necessity. If Aphrodite remained only the foam-born Titaness, she represented a chaotic sexuality that could topple thrones and ignore the laws of men. By reinventing her as a daughter of Zeus, the Greeks created a version of the goddess that functioned within their social structures. They separated the love that inspires the philosopher from the lust that drives the commoner, creating a hierarchy that mirrored their own class systems. This duality allowed the Greeks to worship her as both the architect of the soul and the mistress of the bedroom, yet it also created a tension that would never truly be resolved. In the temples, these two identities often blurred, but the friction remained. The foam-born Urania reminded the Greeks that beauty and desire were forces of nature, as indifferent and powerful as the ocean itself. The daughter, Pandemos, reminded them that these forces must be governed, moderated, and brought into the light of the hearth. One was the goddess of the heights, the other the goddess of the streets. When a Greek citizen looked toward the horizon, they had to decide which Aphrodite they were calling upon. Was it the ancient force that shattered the sky, or the Olympian daughter who whispered in the ears of lovers? This conflict of canon ensured that she could never be a simple figure of grace. She remained a goddess defined by the contradiction of her birth, a being who was simultaneously a sovereign of the universe and a subordinate of the divine court. By establishing these two lineages, the Greeks didn't just explain her origins, they mapped out the entire landscape of human longing, from its most violent beginnings to its most civilized ends. This was the birth of a goddess who could rule the heart of a king and the instincts of a beast at the same time, forever caught between the white foam of the sea and the golden halls of her father's house. The transition from the wild, churning salt water to the structured marble of Olympus was not merely a change of scenery, but a shift in the very nature of Aphrodite's existence. While her birth was an accident of divine violence, her life among the gods would be a calculated series of maneuvers. She stepped into the golden halls not as a guest, but as a problem to be solved. Her beauty was so absolute, so disruptive, that it threatened to fracture the fragile peace of her father's house. Every god, from the highest throne to the lowest servant, felt the pull of her presence like a physical weight. To prevent a civil war fueled by jealousy, Zeus made a decision that was as pragmatic as it was cruel. He bound the goddess of desire to Hephaestus, the smith god who walked with a limp and worked in the dark, smoky heat of the subterranean forges. It was a marriage of opposites that satisfied the logic of the law, but ignored the logic of the heart. Hephaestus was a man of iron, soot, and sweat, a master of the tangible world who could shape bronze into living gold. He was quiet, diligent, and physically scarred by his fall from the heavens.
Aphrodite, by contrast, was the embodiment of the ephemeral. She was the scent of myrtle and the warmth of a summer breeze. She belonged to the light, to the open air, and to the fluid movements of dance. In the cold logic of the Olympians, Hephaestus was the safest choice because he was the least likely to provoke the vanity of his brothers. But the gods forgot that you cannot cage a fire by surrounding it with cold metal. You only make the fire burn hotter for a way out. That exit arrived in the form of Ares, the god of war. If Hephaestus represented the slow, methodical labor of the earth, Ares was the sudden, violent surge of the blood. He was tall, striking, and carried the scent of bronze and adrenaline. While the other gods feared his temper and his thirst for conflict, Aphrodite saw in him a reflection of her own intensity. War and love are both forces that operate outside the boundaries of reason, demanding total surrender and offering no guarantees of safety. Their affair was not just a rebellion against a forced marriage, it was a cosmic alignment. When the god of the forge went down to his anvils, the god of war climbed the stairs to the goddess's chambers. They believed they were invisible, tucked away in the shadows of the divine palace. But in a world inhabited by immortals, there are no true secrets. Helios, the sun who sees everything as he drives his chariot across the sky, observed the lovers in their most private moments. He took this knowledge to Hephaestus, whispering the truth into the ear of the husband who had spent his life being overlooked. Hephaestus did not respond with the characteristic rage of a warrior. He did not challenge Ares to a duel or storm into the bedroom with a blade. Instead, he responded as a craftsman. He went to his forge and began to work on a project that required a delicacy even he had never before attempted. He hammered out links of bronze so thin they were invisible to the naked eye, stronger than diamond and more flexible than silk. He wove these into a net, a web of metal designed to catch the very thing that usually slips through the fingers, desire itself. He draped this trap over the great bed, hiding it within the folds of the fine linens, and then announced he was leaving for a long stay on the island of Lemnos. It was a classic ruse, and Ares fell for it before the gates of the palace had even finished echoing with the sound of Hephaestus's departure. As the two lovers lay together, convinced of their safety, the mechanism was triggered. The invisible bronze net snapped shut, binding them together in an embrace they could not break. The more they struggled, the tighter the links became, pinning their limbs in a humiliating display of their own intimacy. When Hephaestus returned, he didn't just walk in alone. He threw open the doors and called for all the gods to witness his shame, and by extension, the shame of the most beautiful woman and the most fearsome man on Olympus. He demanded justice. He demanded the return of his dowry. But as the gods gathered around the bed, something unexpected happened. The halls did not fill with righteous anger or the somber weight of judgment. Instead, they filled with the sound that would echo through the centuries: laughter. It began as a ripple among the younger gods and grew to a roar that shook the foundations of the mountain. They laughed at the sight of the mighty Ares, the butcher of men, tangled like a common fish in a net. They laughed at Aphrodite, whose grace had been turned into a clumsy, static pose. This laughter was not a sign of cruelty, but a recognition of a profound truth. The gods were laughing at the absurdity of their own natures. Here were the most powerful forces in the universe, rendered completely helpless by a few grams of bronze and their own uncontrollable urges. Hephaestus had won his revenge, but in doing so, he had proven that beauty and war could never truly be contained by the laws of men or gods. As the laughter subsided and the net was eventually lifted, the stains of the scandal remained, marking a turning point in the domestic life of the mountain. Aphrodite had been caught, but she had also exposed the secret truth of the heavens, that even among the stars, we are all prisoners of the heart.
But to be a prisoner of the heart is to be subject to a warden who demands total submission. For Aphrodite, love was never a gift freely given to all. It was a tax on the soul, and those who refused to pay found themselves crushed under the weight of her divine vanity. If the gods on the mountain had been exposed as creatures of scandal, the mortals on the ground were about to learn that Aphrodite's grace was a double-edged blade. We often mistake her for a soft figure, a motherly presence of warmth and affection, but the ancient mind saw her differently. To the Greeks, she was a force of nature as volatile as a storm and as indifferent to human suffering as the sea from which she rose. She was the architect of a specific kind of ruin called ate, a divine madness that stripped a person of their reason and led them toward their own destruction. Love was not a choice, it was an infection, a fever sent from the stars to humble the proud. Consider the tragedy of Hippolytus. He was a young man of exceptional purity, a hunter who spent his days in the deep shadows of the forest, devoted entirely to Artemis, the goddess of the moon and the chase. In his devotion to the cold, distant beauty of the wilderness, he made the fatal mistake of scorning Aphrodite. He called her the least of the gods. He boasted that he had no need of the messy, sweaty business of human desire. In his mind, he was above the reach of the heart. But Aphrodite did not take insults lightly. She did not strike him down with a physical blow or a bolt of lightning. Instead, she chose a more surgical, more agonizing method of execution. She turned her gaze toward Hippolytus's stepmother, Queen Phaedra. Aphrodite breathed a poisoned longing into Phaedra's lungs. It was a desire so sharp and so illicit that it burned the queen from the inside out. Phaedra did not want to love her stepson. She fought against the impulse. She wept for her own honor, and she prayed for the feeling to subside. But the goddess was relentless. This was the true nature of Aphrodite's agency. She did not just influence events, she colonized the human mind. When Hippolytus rejected Phaedra's forced advances, the gears of the goddess's trap began to turn with a terrifying precision. Lies were told, a father's curse was invoked, and Hippolytus was eventually dragged to his death by his own horses, his body broken against the jagged rocks of the shore. Aphrodite stood back and watched, her honor satisfied by the total annihilation of a family. To her, the cost of a few mortal lives was a small price to pay for the preservation of her status as the supreme power over the human spirit. Then there was the matter of Psyche. If Hippolytus represented the danger of rejecting love, Psyche represented the danger of rivaling it. She was a mortal princess of such blinding beauty that men began to forget the altars of the goddess. The temples of Aphrodite grew cold. The grass grew long between the marble pillars of her shrines because the people were too busy queuing to catch a glimpse of a human girl. This was an existential threat. For Aphrodite, beauty was her currency and her weapon. She could not allow a mortal to devalue the divine brand. Her response was not just one of anger, but of calculated, bureaucratic cruelty. She did not simply wish for Psyche to die, she wanted her to suffer under the weight of her own inadequacy. She sent her son, Eros, to make the girl fall in love with the most hideous creature on earth. But when that plan backfired, and Eros himself fell for the mortal, Aphrodite's fury only intensified.
She became the ultimate shadow mother, a figure of terrifying authority who forced Psyche into a series of impossible labors. She demanded that the girl sort a mountain of mixed grains before the sun set, a task designed to break the mind through sheer exhaustion. She sent her to gather the golden fleece from man-eating sheep. She even sent her into the literal depths of the underworld to fetch a box of divine beauty from Persephone, knowing full well that no mortal returns from the land of the dead unchanged. Throughout these trials, Aphrodite showed no mercy, no sisterly bond, and no motherly compassion. She was a sovereign defending her borders. She viewed Psyche not as her daughter-in-law, but as an intruder in the sacred space of the immortal. This is the Aphrodite the modern world often forgets, the one who demands sacrifice and total recognition. She is the goddess who reminds us that desire is a form of power, and power is never shared willingly. The Greeks understood that when love enters a room, logic leaves it. They saw the shaking of the hands, the sweating of the brow, and the loss of the will as symptoms of a divine occupation. To fall in love was to be drafted into a war you didn't ask for, fighting on behalf of a goddess who cared nothing for your survival. The stories of Hippolytus and Psyche serve as a warning. They tell us that the heart is not a safe place. It is a landscape of high stakes where one wrong word or one moment of hubris can invite a catastrophe that echoes through generations. Aphrodite's agency was her ability to make the world stop and look at her, and if they looked away, she would burn their world down to get their attention back. She was the master of the silent strike, the one who moved through the blood and the breath, proving that while we might think we are the masters of our own fates, we are always living in the shadow of the goddess who invented the very concept of wanting. As the sun set over the Aegean, the smoke from her altars was often mixed with the salt of human tears, a reminder that to love is to be vulnerable to a force that is as ancient and as pitiless as the stars themselves. But those stars, cold and distant, could never truly grasp the weight of a heartbeat that is destined to stop. For a goddess who commanded the tides of attraction and the heat of the blood, there was a profound irony in her own susceptibility to the very thing she governed. To understand Aphrodite is to understand that she was not merely a puppet master of human emotion, she was often its most heartbroken victim. This vulnerability is most vividly captured in the moments when her gaze fell upon the world of men, not as a patron, but as a lover. The Homeric hymn to Aphrodite provides a startling window into this divine fragility. It tells us that Zeus, weary of Aphrodite's pride and her habit of making the gods fall for mortals, decided to turn her own power against her. He cast a sweet longing into her mind, directing her desire toward a Trojan shepherd named Anchises. When she saw him tending his cattle on the slopes of Mount Ida, the goddess of love was, for the first time, truly ensnared. She did not approach him as a deity. In a move born of a strange, burgeoning shame, she disguised herself as a mortal maiden, spinning a web of lies about her origin to soothe his suspicions. This deception is a crucial pivot in her mythology. It suggests that even the goddess of beauty recognized a fundamental incompatibility between the eternal and the ephemeral. When the truth was finally revealed, when she stood before him in her full, terrifying radiance, the atmosphere changed from passion to dread. Anchises was struck with a paralyzing fear, knowing that no man prospers who sleeps with a goddess. yet it is Aphrodite's reaction that carries the most weight. She spoke of her deep humiliation. By lying with a mortal, she had surrendered her untouchable status. She had become part of the cycle of aging and decay, if only by association. She looked at Anchises and saw not just a lover, but a countdown. She told him the story of Tithonus, a man granted immortality but not eternal youth, who eventually withered into a cicada, a pathetic remnant of a human being. Through Anchises, Aphrodite confronted the reality that to love a human is to witness a slow-motion tragedy. Their son, Aeneas, would be a hero, but he would also be a constant reminder of a night that brought the goddess of the heavens down to the dirt of the earth. This intersection of divine desire and mortal frailty found its most painful expression in the story of Adonis. If Anchises represented the shame of the goddess, Adonis represented her inconsolable grief. Born from a myrrh tree, a transformation triggered by the forbidden passions of his mother, Adonis was a being of such singular beauty that he belonged to no one world. Aphrodite was so captivated by the infant that she hid him in a chest and entrusted him to Persephone in the underworld. This act set the stage for a cosmic tug-of-war. Persephone, the queen of the dead, was just as enthralled by the boy's beauty as Aphrodite was. This rivalry between the goddess of life and the goddess of death serves as a metaphor for the nature of beauty itself. It is something we want to keep in the light, yet it is always being pulled toward the shadows. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Adonis would spend part of the year in the dark halls of the dead and part of the year in the sun-drenched forests with Aphrodite. The time he spent with Aphrodite was a season of feverish intensity. She, who usually lounged in the luxury of Olympus, took to the rugged woods, dressing like a huntress to stay by his side. She warned him of the dangers of the wild, of the boars and lions that did not care for beauty or divine protection. But youth is often deaf to the warnings of love. The end came with the rush of a wild boar's tusks. Whether the beast was sent by a jealous Ares or simply a manifestation of nature's indifferent violence, the result was the same. Adonis lay bleeding in the dust, his life draining into the soil. Aphrodite's arrival was too late. The goddess who could command the hearts of kings and gods found herself powerless against a simple wound. As she cradled his cooling body, her tears mixed with his blood. From this tragic alchemy, the anemone flower sprang, a bloom that is strikingly beautiful but incredibly short-lived, its petals easily scattered by the wind. This transformation is the ultimate summary of the Aphrodite who loves mortals. She does not offer a love that saves, she offers a love that memorializes. The death of Adonis forced a shift in the way the ancient world viewed the goddess. She was no longer just the golden lady of laughter, she was the mourner. The festivals dedicated to Adonis were not celebrations of joy, but rites of lamentation. Women would plant gardens in shallow pots, gardens of Adonis, which would sprout quickly and die just as fast, mirroring the fleeting life of the youth. This connection between beauty, desire, and inevitable decay is the darker undercurrent of her myth. It suggests that beauty is most poignant when it is on the verge of disappearing. We desire things more fiercely because we know we cannot keep them. Aphrodite's tragedies with Anchises and Adonis teach us that even for a goddess, love is a gamble against time. To reach out and touch the mortal world is to accept the salt of tears and the scent of the grave. She remains the patron of the heartbeat, but she is also the one who knows exactly what it sounds like when that heartbeat finally stops, leaving nothing behind but a flower in the wind and a memory that refuses to fade.
That memory, fragile and enduring as a petal, was only the beginning of a larger pattern where the personal desires of the divine dictated the fates of thousands. Love is never an isolated event in the ancient world. It is a weight placed on one side of a scale that inevitably tips the balance of power. To understand the most catastrophic tipping point in Aphrodite's history, we must look beyond the individual heart to a wedding on the slopes of Mount Pelion. This was the marriage of the mortal king Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, an event intended to celebrate the hierarchy of the gods, but it became the setting for a slight that would burn a civilization to the ground. The guest list was a map of the celestial order, featuring every major deity, every minor spirit of the woods and sea, and the most celebrated heroes of the age. Yet there was one omission. Eris, the goddess of discord, was not invited. It was a calculated exclusion intended to preserve the peace of the ceremony, but in the logic of the gods, to ignore a force of nature is to invite its most violent manifestation. Eris did not storm the gates. She arrived quietly, a shadow at the edge of the light, and tossed a single object onto the floor of the banquet hall. It was a golden apple, shimmering with a light that seemed to pull at the eyes of everyone in the room. Inscribed upon its skin was a single word, Callisti, to the fairest. In an instant, the joy of the wedding vanished. The apple acted as a mirror for the ego, and 3 women stepped forward to claim it. Hera, the queen of the gods, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite. This was no longer a celebration of a marriage. It had become a trial of supremacy. Zeus, sensing the danger of choosing between his wife, his daughter, and the goddess of desire, refused to act as judge. He knew that to pick one was to earn the eternal hatred of the other 2. Instead, he delegated the burden to a mortal. He chose a man who was living as a simple shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida, a youth named Paris. Paris was not a common laborer by birth. He was a prince of Troy, cast out in infancy because of a prophecy that he would one day bring about the destruction of his city. He lived in the quiet ignorance of his royal blood, tending flocks and knowing nothing of the political tensions brewing across the sea. When the 3 goddesses appeared before him in a flash of blinding light, the world of the shepherd ended and the world of the pawn began. Each goddess offered him a bribe that represented her specific domain, turning a question of beauty into a question of destiny. Hera offered him the thing she valued most, absolute power. She promised him to make him the emperor of Asia, a ruler whose name would make the earth tremble. It was a promise of stability and dominion. Athena offered him the perfection of the mind and the hand. She promised him the wisdom to solve any problem and the skill to lead any army to victory. Had Paris chosen either of these, the history of the Mediterranean would have been one of unified empires and strategic brilliance. But Aphrodite understood the human heart better than her sisters. She did not offer him a crown or a shield. She offered him a person. She promised him the love of Helen of Sparta, the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. Paris handed the apple to Aphrodite. In that moment, the goddess of love secured her status as the most beautiful, but she did so by committing an act of profound geopolitical sabotage. This was not a simple gift of a bride. It was a maneuver that prioritized her own vanity over the survival of nations. Helen was not a prize to be won. She was a queen of a sovereign Greek city-state, and more importantly, she was the wife of Menelaus. By promising Helen to Paris, Aphrodite was choosing to break the sacred laws of hospitality and the fragile treaties that held the Greek kings together.
Aphrodite's victory was a calculated disruption of the status quo. She knew that the kings of Greece had sworn an oath to protect Helen's marriage, a pact intended to prevent the very kind of conflict Paris was about to ignite. By dangling the promise of Helen before a young Trojan prince, Aphrodite was intentionally pulling a thread that would unravel the entire social fabric of the Bronze Age. She was not concerned with the blood that would be spilled on the beaches of Ilium, or the 10 years of suffering that would follow. For her, the Trojan War was the necessary cost of a golden apple. This decision highlights a darker side of Aphrodite's influence. We often view love as a constructive force, something that builds families and bridges divides. But here, Aphrodite uses love as a weapon of mass destruction. She treats the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world as a secondary concern to her own reputation among the Olympians. She did not just give Paris a woman, she gave him a justification to commit an act of international theft. When Paris eventually arrived in Sparta as a guest and left as a kidnapper, he was acting under the divine mandate of the goddess of love. The resulting conflict was not merely a war over a woman, it was a war triggered by a goddess who refused to be second best. As the Greek fleet began to gather at Aulis, and as the kings of the West sharpened their spears for a decade of slaughter, Aphrodite stood on the heights of Olympus, the golden apple in her hand and the world at her feet. She had won her title, and the cost would be paid in the lives of heroes and the ashes of a great city. The heartbeat she once listened to in the chest of Adonis was now being replaced by the rhythmic drum of war, a sound she had orchestrated with a single, devastating promise. The smoke rising from the plains of Troy was not merely the soot of burning wood. It was the physical manifestation of a goddess's whim. That rhythmic drum of war, which had replaced the steady heartbeat of her lost Adonis, now resonated through the very earth beneath her feet. Aphrodite did not watch this conflict from the high, cold peaks of Olympus, shielded by distance and indifference. She was present in the thick of the grit, her golden robes trailing through the blood-soaked dust of the Scamander plain. For her, this was personal. The war was the direct consequence of her promise to Paris, and she felt a proprietary duty to ensure her favorites survived the slaughter she had set in motion. When the duel between Paris and Menelaus reached its breaking point, the air itself seemed to shudder. Paris, a man of soft words and beautiful features, was no match for the seasoned iron of the Spartan king. As Menelaus dragged him by his horsehair crest toward the Greek lines, the end seemed certain. But the laws of mortal combat hold no sway over the goddess of desire. She moved with a speed that defied human sight, shattering the leather strap of Paris's helmet and shrouding the young prince in a dense, unnatural mist. To the soldiers on the ground, it appeared as though their enemy had simply vanished into the ether. In reality, Aphrodite had plucked him from the jaws of death, carrying him back to the scented safety of his bedchamber in Troy. It was an act of blatant divine interference, a declaration that the logic of the heart would always override the logic of the sword. She stood over him there, not as a distant deity, but as a guardian who demanded he continue to play his part in the drama she had composed. Yet her intervention was not limited to the preservation of lovers. On the battlefield, she transformed into a figure of maternal desperation. Her son, Aeneas, the hero born from her union with the mortal Anchises, stood as the last great hope of the Trojan line. When the Greek hero Diomedes pinned Aeneas down, raining stones and bronze upon him, Aphrodite did not hesitate. She descended into the chaos, throwing her luminous white arms around her son to shield him from the onslaught. She spread the fold of her radiant robe before him, a fragile barrier against the whistling spears. Here, the goddess of grace was forced to confront the raw, ugly brutality of human violence. It was in this moment of protection that the unthinkable occurred. Diomedes, his eyes cleared by the goddess Athena to perceive the divine, saw Aphrodite not as an untouchable force of nature, but as a target. He did not recoil in holy fear. Instead, he lunged forward with his sharpened spear. The bronze point tore through her celestial robes and pierced the palm of her hand, just above the wrist. For the first time in the history of the epic, a mortal had drawn the blood of a goddess. It was not red blood that spilled onto the Trojan soil, but ichor, the clear, shimmering fluid that flows through the veins of the immortals. The scream she let out was a sound that momentarily silenced the clatter of shields. The wound was a profound symbol of the vulnerability of love when it enters the domain of war. It demonstrated that even the most powerful of human emotions can be mutilated and scarred by the cold machinery of conflict. Aphrodite, overcome by a pain she had never known, dropped her son and fled the field, her golden chariot racing back toward the heights of Olympus. As she retreated, the mocking laughter of Athena and Hera followed her, ridiculing a goddess of the bedroom who dared to walk the path of warriors. Back on the mountain, she sought comfort in the lap of her mother, Dione, weeping for the cruelty of men. But while the other gods saw her wounding as a defeat, the long arc of history would reveal it as a necessary sacrifice. Though she had been forced to drop Aeneas, her intervention had delayed his death long enough for Apollo to carry him to safety. This was the turning point that the poets would remember centuries later. By putting her own immortal body between her son and the Greek spear, she ensured the survival of the Trojan bloodline. The survival of Aeneas was not just a footnote in the fall of a single city. It was the seed of an entire civilization. If Aphrodite had remained on the sidelines, if she had not bled on that dusty plain, Aeneas would have perished with the rest of the Trojan princes. There would have been no flight from the burning ruins, no journey across the Mediterranean, and no founding of the settlement that would eventually grow into the Roman Empire. The Romans would later claim her their divine ancestress, Venus Genetrix, the mother of their people. They understood what the Greeks at Troy did not, that her presence on the battlefield was not an act of vanity, but an act of creation. In the heat of the Iliad, Aphrodite proved that love is not a passive bystander to history. It is an active, often violent force that drives the movement of nations. She bore the scar on her hand as a badge of her commitment to the lineage she had started. The walls of Troy would eventually crumble, and the beautiful Paris would eventually fall, but the bloodline she protected would endure. She transitioned from the goddess of the fleeting kiss to the architect of a legacy that would span 1,000 years. As the fires of the city eventually lit the night sky, she looked down not with regret for her wound, but with the steady gaze of a mother who knew that the end of one story was merely the painful labor preceding the birth of another. The drum of war was loud, but the heartbeat of the survivor she saved would beat longer and louder, echoing through the marble halls of a Rome that was yet to be. This connection to the founding of empires suggests a goddess far more formidable than the delicate figure often seen lounging in a gilded shell. To find the true origin of the Lady of the Romans, we must travel back across the Ionian Sea, past the soft meadows of Cyprus, to the rugged, wind-swept cliffs of Kythera and the iron-willed city-state of Sparta. Here, the archaeological record strips away the silk and roses, revealing a deity clad in bronze and carrying the weight of a spear. This is the version of the goddess known as Aphrodite Aurea. The name itself is a provocation, literally meaning the warlike Aphrodite, or Aphrodite of Ares. For the modern observer, this feels like a contradiction of terms. We are taught to see love and war as opposites, one a creative force and the other a destructive one. But to the ancient mind, particularly in the earliest days of Greek worship, these two forces were twins, born from the same primordial heat. On the island of Kythera, ancient writers tell us of the oldest temple to Aphrodite in all of Greece. It was not a place of soft cushions and perfumes, but a fortress-like sanctuary. Excavations and historical accounts describe cult statues that would shock a later Renaissance painter. In these holy places, the goddess was depicted not in the nude, but fully armed. She wore a helmet pushed back from her brow, a sword strapped to her waist, and a shield held firm against her side. These statues represent a direct lineage from the Eastern goddesses like Ishtar and Astarte, who were unapologetic mistresses of the battlefield long before they reached the Aegean shores. The Spartans, who saw life as a perpetual preparation for conflict, embraced this version of her with a singular intensity. In Sparta, she was not a secondary figure to be called upon for a marriage blessing. She was a foundational power. Pausanias, the ancient traveler, recorded seeing a statue of Aphrodite in Sparta that was bound in chains. While some later poets interpreted this as a symbol of the fidelity of marriage, historians suggest a much older, darker meaning. The chains were intended to keep the goddess of victory and passion within the city, ensuring her fierce power could never abandon the Spartan people. To the Spartans, the grace of a woman and the strength of a hoplite were not mutually exclusive. They understood that the same fire that fuels the passion of the bedroom is the fire that sustains a soldier in the final, desperate hours of a siege. This brings us to a profound philosophical realization that the Greeks understood instinctively, but which we often struggle to articulate. Why link the goddess of beauty with the god of war? Why place a spear in the hand of the lady of desire? The answer lies in the psychological state of the human being at their most vulnerable and most powerful. The Greeks recognized that there are two primary moments in the human experience where the rational mind, the logical, calculating part of the brain we use to navigate the market or the law court, completely evaporates. Those two moments are the height of sexual passion and the frenzy of mortal combat. In both states, the heartbeat accelerates until it thunders in the ears. The vision narrows. The sense of self dissolves into a singular driving purpose. Whether you are charging a phalanx or falling into the arms of a lover, you are no longer a creature of logic. You are a creature of instinct. You have lost control. In the ancient world, this loss of control was seen as a divine visitation. It was a form of madness, a holy mania, that stripped away the pretenses of civilization and revealed the raw, animal truth of our existence. By worshipping Aphrodite as a war goddess, the ancients were acknowledging that sex and war are merely two sides of the same divine coin. They are the twin peaks of human intensity. This duality is captured perfectly in the archaeological finds of the Acrocorinth, the great citadel overlooking the city of Corinth. There, the cult of Aphrodite was famous for its wealth and its thousands of temple servants, but the image they worshipped was based on a warrior prototype. Even as the centuries passed and her image became softer and more focused on aesthetic beauty, the remnants of her martial past remained hidden in plain sight. Many of the most famous statues we admire today, like the Venus de Milo, are believed by many scholars to be variations of the Aphrodite aria. If you look closely at the positioning of her arms, which have been lost to time, many reconstructions suggest she was not admiring her own reflection, but was actually holding the heavy, polished shield of Ares, using its surface as a mirror. It is a striking image, the goddess of love using the instrument of war to see herself. It suggests that her beauty is not just a passive quality, but a weapon. It implies that the attraction she inspires is a force of nature as unstoppable as a bronze-tipped spear. In the shrines of Sparta and the high temples of Kythera, there was no shame in this connection. They knew that the impulse to create life and the impulse to defend it or take it are inextricably linked. One cannot exist without the other. To love is to risk everything, and to fight is to value something enough to die for it. By the time the stories of her birth and her Roman legacy reached their peak, the armor might have been tucked away behind a veil, but the spirit of the warrior remained. She was never just a goddess of the heart. She was the goddess of the pulse, the surge of blood that reminds us we are alive, terrified, and beautiful all at once. This fierce ancient Aphrodite reminds us that desire is not a quiet thing. It is a siege, a conquest, and a surrender, echoing through time with the same intensity as the clash of shields on a distant, dusty plain.
That echo of shields and the roar of the siege carried a terrifying weight into the quiet courtyards of Athens, where the chaos of the battlefield was replaced by the disciplined silence of the academy. But the philosophers knew that the most dangerous wars were not fought on dusty plains, but within the confines of the human heart. They looked upon the primal power of Aphrodite, the goddess who could unstring the knees of the strongest warrior and turn a king into a fool, and they felt a profound sense of unease. To the Greek mind, order was the ultimate virtue, yet here was a force that defied every boundary, a deity who governed the messy, irrational, and often violent impulses of the flesh. They realized that if they could not defeat this goddess, they would have to find a way to domesticate her. They would have to use the tools of logic to build a cage for the uncontrollable. This intellectual project reached its peak in the mid-4th century before the Common Era, most famously within the pages of Plato's Symposium. Imagine a gathering of the city's most brilliant minds, resting on couches after a night of celebration, tasked with delivering speeches in praise of love. It is here that we see the birth of a profound psychological schism. The speaker, Pausanias, takes the floor and argues that there is not one Aphrodite, but two. He suggests that because there are two goddesses, there must be two distinct types of love. This was not merely a poetic flourish, it was an act of spiritual surgery, a deliberate attempt to separate the sacred from the profane, the mind from the body, and the celestial from the carnal. The first of these figures is Aphrodite Urania, the heavenly goddess. To define her, the philosophers reached back to the most ancient and violent version of her origin story. They reminded their audience that she was born not from a mother and father, but from the severed genitals of Uranus, the sky god, cast into the sea. Because she had no female element in her birth, the philosophers argued that she represented a love that was purely masculine, purely intellectual, and entirely divorced from the base instincts of procreation. This Aphrodite was the patron of the soul's ascent. She was the spark of inspiration that led a person to seek truth, beauty, and virtue. In this framework, the heavenly love was a pursuit of the mind, a connection between two people that sought to improve the character rather than satisfy the skin. It was a love that looked upward toward the eternal forms, away from the decay of the material world. Standing in direct opposition to this was Aphrodite Pandemos, the goddess of all the people. Her lineage was described as more conventional, the daughter of Zeus and a minor goddess named Dione. Because she was born of both male and female, she was tethered to the earth. She was the common love, the goddess of the streets and the marketplaces. This was the Aphrodite who governed the physical urge, the biological necessity to mate and reproduce. To the elite thinkers of the time, Pandemos was a lesser deity.
She was the one who drove men to seek out the company of women or to lose themselves in fleeting, mindless pleasures. She was considered common because anyone could feel her pull, the peasant, the slave, the uneducated. She required no discipline, no philosophy, and no restraint. She was the raw, pulsing heat of the siege described by the poets, but in the hands of the philosophers, that heat was rebranded as something vulgar and beneath the dignity of a truly realized man. By creating this binary, Greek society was attempting to sanitize a power that had always been inherently dangerous. They were trying to create a hierarchy of emotion where none had previously existed. In the older myths, Aphrodite didn't care if your love was intellectual or physical. She simply struck, and you fell. But by labeling the physical side of desire as common or low, the intellectual elite created a moral escape hatch. They suggested that if one could focus on the heavenly Aphrodite, they could transcend the messy, painful reality of human longing. It was an early form of what we might now call sublimation, taking a primal energy and redirecting it into something socially acceptable, something quiet and manageable. This philosophical split was, at its heart, a defense mechanism against the amikanya, the Greek word for the state of being completely helpless. Aphrodite was the queen of helplessness. She was the one who made you forget your duty, your family, and your very self. For a culture that prized self-mastery above all else, the idea of being a slave to desire was a nightmare. By categorizing the goddess, they were trying to convince themselves that the nightmare could be categorized too. If you can name a thing, you can claim a certain power over it. If you can say, "This feeling I have is merely the common Aphrodite," you have already begun to distance yourself from the experience. You have turned a visceral gut punch into a clinical observation. However, this attempt to tame the goddess had a lasting and perhaps unintended consequence. It introduced a deep-seated suspicion of the body into the foundations of Western thought. It taught us that the spirit and the flesh are in constant conflict, and that one must be suppressed for the other to flourish. The heavenly Aphrodite became the ancestor of our modern ideals of platonic love and intellectual companionship, while the common Aphrodite was relegated to the shadows, associated with shame and lack of control. We see here the beginning of the great divorce between the heart and the loins, a divide that would be widened centuries later by the arrival of new religions and even more rigid moral codes. The philosophers wanted an Aphrodite they could invite into the lecture hall, a goddess who preferred a book to a bedchamber. They wanted a version of desire that didn't sweat, didn't scream, and didn't break things. They tried to turn the salt spray of her birth into the dry ink of a scroll. But even as they spoke of Urania and her lofty heights, they knew that Pandemos was still there, waiting in the dark corners of the city, in the rhythm of the pulse, and in the heat of a stranger's gaze. They could divide her name, they could categorize her functions, and they could build altars to her higher self, but the goddess remained a singular, undivided force. For all their logic and all their beautiful speeches, the philosophers could not truly separate the soul from the body. They could only build a map of the struggle, a map that we are still trying to read today. They tried to turn a hurricane into a weather report, but the storm remained, indifferent to their definitions, waiting for the next heart to conquer.
When that hurricane finally reached the shores of the Italian peninsula, the Romans did not try to hide from the wind. They tried to harness it. To the masters of the Mediterranean, she was no longer merely a fickle force of nature. She became a matriarch, Venus Genetrix, the mother of the Roman people. Julius Caesar claimed her blood flowed through his own veins, turning a goddess of desire into a political asset. By anchoring her to the Julian line, the Romans attempted to domesticate the storm. They built her temples not just to honor love, but to legitimize power.
She was the ancestor of emperors, the silent architect of an empire that stretched to the edges of the known world. She was still beautiful and potent, but she was now dressed in the stola of a Roman matron, her wild edges polished by the demands of statecraft. But as the old gods fell and the cross rose over the ruins of the Forum, this political mother became a theological threat. The early church saw in her reflection not beauty, but a dangerous distraction from the divine. The statues that once breathed with the life of the city were toppled, their features chipped away, their marble bodies buried in the dirt or melted for lime. Aphrodite was driven into the shadows, whispered of as a demon or a lingering ghost of a pagan past. For centuries, the goddess of the sea was a forgotten memory, a name trapped in forbidden manuscripts, her power reduced to a cautionary tale about the perils of the flesh. Then, the earth moved once more. In the workshops of 15th century Florence, the soil of antiquity was overturned, and what emerged was a ghost that refused to stay buried. When Sandro Botticelli stood before his canvas to paint the birth of Venus, he was not just painting a myth, he was witnessing a resurrection. But this was a different goddess than the one who had terrified the heroes of Troy. Emerging from the foam on a giant scallop shell, Botticelli's Venus is a vision of ethereal, melancholic grace. She is the pinnacle of human proportion, a masterpiece of line and light. Yet look closer at her eyes. In this Renaissance rebirth, something fundamental had changed. The Aphrodite of the Greeks was an active, often vengeful agent who commanded the hearts of gods and men alike. Botticelli's Venus is strangely passive. She does not look at the viewer. She gazes into a middle distance, her hands modestly covering her form, as if caught in a moment of vulnerability. She has been transformed from a participant into a spectacle. The dangerous, chaotic goddess was being domesticated again, not by politics this time, but by art. She became an icon of aesthetic perfection, a symbol of the soul's longing for the divine, stripped of her agency and her teeth. The storm had been captured in a frame, frozen in a moment of eternal, silent beauty, waiting for the world to decide if it wanted a goddess to worship or a masterpiece to admire.
That choice was never truly made. Instead, the world chose both. We see her today not in temples of cold marble, but in the relentless, feverish pursuit of an impossible standard. She lives in the digital glow of our screens, in the curated symmetry of a profile, and in the vast industries built on the desperate promise of transformation. Yet, to reduce her to a mere cosmetic ideal is to miss the lightning for the thunder. Aphrodite was never just about the surface. She was the electric current running beneath it. Our modern rituals of romance, the frantic heartbeat of a first meeting, the irrational ache of longing, and the wreckage of a broken heart are the direct echoes of her ancient power. We have tried to domesticate love, attempting to turn it into a predictable science of compatibility algorithms and psychological profiles. But Aphrodite remains the one variable that refuses to be solved. She represents that beautiful, necessary chaos of existence where logic fails and raw instinct takes hold. You cannot negotiate with the tides, and you cannot argue with the sudden violent recognition of beauty that halts the breath in your lungs. She is the eternal reminder that we are not merely thinking machines, but feeling animals. The ancient world understood something we often try to forget.
that attraction is a force of nature as indifferent and as devastating as a hurricane. It can build civilizations or burn them to the ground, and it does so without seeking permission or offering an apology. This is the truth we carry in our marrow. We fear the power of attraction because it strips away our carefully constructed control, revealing how fragile our reason truly is when faced with the divine. We worship it because in that surrender we find the only spark capable of making the mundane feel miraculous. The goddess has not left us. She has simply changed her mask, moving from the pedestal to the pulse. She remains the silent architect of our greatest joys and our deepest despairs, waiting for the next moment to remind us that as long as there is desire, the storm will never truly be still.